Hi, this is Simon Upstall and welcome to another tutorial for Apple Motion, and today I want to show you how to create this matrix tunnel effect. So this is an endlessly looping effect, quite a bit involved in setting it up, but I think you're going to have a lot of fun with the final compositing of it. So let's get going. Okay, so let's just set up our project. We're going to go with 1920 by 1920. We're going to have a frame rate of 24 frames a second and a duration of 13 seconds. Now this is not our final project. This is just where we're going to make a set of elements that we can then composite into our final project. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come over to the library and generators, and I'm going to bring in grid. So for my grid settings, I want a background opacity of 0. Let's go with, say, 2048 by 2048 for the width and height. Let's set the line width to 5, and let's go with 250 for the background width and height. The next thing I'm going to do is I am going to add an extrusion to this group. So stylize and extrude. What I want for this is 1 for the distance and a back size of 0. So as is, it's a bit boring, but what we can do is to break it up a bit. So let's come over to the generators and bring in a clouds. And let's turn it off. We're not interested in seeing it. What we are going to do though is add an image mask to the grid. We're going to use the clouds as the source, and we're going to switch to luminance. And what we can do is come over here. We do need to set our width and height to be large enough. So again, let's go for 2048 by 2048. Let's also open up the gradient, select this black tag and set its location to 50%. And immediately you can see that's made a huge amount of difference. We've got these nice radiating lines, just a sense of that grid as well. And what we can also do is come back into the grid and just offset its X 125 and its Y 125. And let's also just add another image mask to it. So we can do this to the group. In fact, let's select the group, rectangle, hold down the Shift key, draw out a mask like that. I want 480 for the size. Make sure to center it up. And let's just feather it, positive 270. And then obviously we need to invert it. So it just cuts a hole in the middle like that. So let's call this group grid. And we're done with that, so we can close it up. Let's now make a new group at the top. And let's call this group lines. So I'm going to come down, select the line tool, and holding down the Shift key, I'm going to draw out a horizontal line like that. Let's come over to geometry. Let's have a start of negative 960 and an end of positive 960. Come over to properties and reset the position. And then what we're going to do is we are going to make a replicator out of this. So object replicate. For the replicator, we're going to turn on 3D. We're going to select box for the shape and outline for the arrangement. Let's have 1920 for the size initially. Let's open it up and let's have a depth of 2000. And let's have 1 column, 4 rows and 7 ranks. So I turned on shuffle order here, but please ignore that. And let's also set the angle to 90 and turn on a line angle. Okay, I think we're probably done. Oh no, let's just also set the scale end to 150 and let's have some scale randomness of 75%. So then let's take this replicator and duplicate it. So right click, duplicate. Let's come over to properties, rotate it through 90 degrees, and maybe let's come into the replicator, click on the random seed a few times, not that it matters a huge amount. Maybe just reduce the number of ranks to 6. It's just about getting some variation here. Let's click on this random seed as well. What we're going to do with this group, which we didn't do with the grid group, is to turn it to 3D. Okay, so that's our lines sorted. Next, what I want to do is make another new group. So objects new group, and that is 3D. So into this new group, we're going to import from our assets folder the thing called circuit border. And I'm going to give you a link to that in the description, obviously. So import that. It looks like this. So we want to do a number of things with this. The first of which is to come to filters and color and threshold. And we want to set that threshold value to something like 0.12. And the smoothness, let's go for 0.1. And that just removes those grayscale values. So then I'm going to add filters, stylize, and relief. So I want to zero out these two back values like that. And I want to set my front size to 1.5. And let's set the fuzziness all the way up to 1. And that's given us some interesting depth to this effect. You can see we've got this sort of 3D effect on there. In actual fact, what I'm going to do next is to add a camera. And before I do that, I'm going to do Object, New Group, and then drag all of these into the new group. And then let's bring in a camera. And let's just move the camera away so we can see what's happening with those elements like that. Actually, let's turn off the lines and the grid while we work on this. And let's call this group here Circuit. Okay, so we're a bit more organized. We can come back into our circuit border group. So after the relief, I'm going to add filters and masks and keying and luma keyer. It hasn't done much, but it's important for the next step, which is that we're going to add filters, stylize, and extrude. So for the extrude, we want a distance of 1, and we want a back size of 1.9. And you can see this is giving us these really nice radiating lines that are coming forward like that. Let's just maybe play with that back brightness. Yes, let's go with that. Let's reduce that down to 0. That gives us a little bit of a fade off of those lines. And then finally, I'm going to add one more luma keyer, and that's just going to help with the transparency. So just drop in a luma keyer like that. You can see that little change there. It's made this as against that. So you see, without the luma keyer, we're getting that sort of solid area. With the luma keyer, we're getting the see-through alpha. So let's switch back to the color view. I was just switching into the alpha mode there to show you. Switch back to the color view and we've got that. So that's our circuit board. And the final element is going to be some lights. And this is going to be nice. So let's come to Object and New Group. Let's call this one Lights. Let's turn off that circuit temporarily. So the first thing I'm going to do is come down and select the Circle tool. Hold down the Shift key, draw out a small circle. Let's reset it. Shape, Geometry. Let's set its radius to 4. And having done so, let's come over to Object and make Particles. So for this emitter, we want a rectangle for the shape. We want a size of 960. Let's go with an emission angle of 180 and an emission range of 0. Let's have a birth rate of 10. Let's reduce the speed down to 0. Oh yes, and the life I want to be 12. And I'm going to come down here to the gradient, open that up, click here, and click here. This one here, I'm going to set the opacity to 0. This one here, set the opacity to 0. So just fading in like that. And finally, I want to add a bit of scale randomness. So scale randomness of 75. Oh, you know what I didn't do is I didn't set up the arrangement. So we want an arrangement of outline for this. So we've got a little square with dots around the edge. Pretty boring, really. But what we're now going to do is we're going to clone this emitter. So right click and make clone layer. Let's turn off the original emitter. And the clone we're going to replicate. So Object and Replicate. And this is where it starts to get a lot more interesting. So shape is going to be line. Let's turn on 3D. Let's open up these start and end here. Let's zero out the X, but have 3000 for that Z start. Zero out this X end and have negative 3000 for the X end. And let's have 18 points. And then let's come down and set the angle end to 720. So I set the source frame offset to 1 here, but really I should have gone for something like 10, 12, maybe even more. So experiment with that. And what I've forgotten to do actually is to come back to my emitter, and I wanted to add filters and stylize and again extrude. And let's come over to the extrude Let's set its distance to 1, and let's set the back size to 0.5, the front brightness to 0.05, and the back brightness to 0. And now we're getting this really nice effect. So having done all that, I'm going to set my play range to be exactly 10 seconds. So I'm going to come to 9:23 on the timeline, and I'm going to come to mark and mark play range out, because that's all that we actually want for any of these. And the final thing I want to do is to come over to my camera and give it some animation. So let's just come over to properties, and this is Z position. Let's first of all zero that out, and let's now add a ramp to it. And let's have a start value of, I think, 5250 and an end value of -1920. So then I want to come to 9:23 on the timeline, so a frame before 10 seconds. And with the ramp selected, I want to come to mark and mark out. And you can see the camera is now running for that duration rather than the 30 seconds. Just a brief explanation of that. We needed our emitter to give us 30 seconds worth of media, otherwise these little lights would pop. So that's the reason we started with a 30-second timeline, and we're finishing with a 10-second one. So the other thing I want to do is I want to do the same thing with this group. Come to 9:23. I want to add behaviors, basic motion, fade in, fade out. And so with that fade in, fade out selected, I want to come to mark and mark out. So now we're fading in at the start of that 10 seconds and then fading out at the end of it like this. What I also want to do is take my lights group and come to its Z position and set that to 2750. And that's going to just make sure they clear the frame at the end, which is good. We're going to start back there, which is also good. So let's just do a little bit more tidying up. Let's turn off the lights. Let's come into our circuit, turn that on. I don't know why that was off. And this scale needs to be set to 50. I've already done that actually, but you just need to make sure that scale is set to 50. And again, that's going to make sure that it disappears at the end of those 10 seconds. So that's the circuit. Let's just check it in on our lines. So here's our lines. What we want to do here is set the group position to be something like 3500 on Z, and let's maybe just reduce that opacity down to 30%. We don't need all that opacity. So now they clear quite nicely like that. Actually, maybe I've overdone that. Let's actually move them further back. Let's go for, I don't know, 2500. Is that going to be good? We don't want everything disappearing at the same time, but yeah, let's go for 2500 on that Z. And finally, just check it in on our grid. How is that looking? So I think our grid is looking pretty good. Okay, so what we can now do is we can render these out. And I want to show you a really interesting trick. So we're going to come to the Share menu, Export Movie, and we're going to come to Settings, and we're going to select ProRes 444. And we're going to make sure that Use Play Range is selected. I'm going to click Next. I've already rendered these out, but I'm going to overwrite them just for the purpose of this tutorial. So I'm going to select the grid, but you can type the name there at the top and save, replace. And I'm going to immediately, while it's still rendering, you can see it's rendering down there. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn on my lines. And I'm going to come to Share, Export Movie, Settings 4444, all good. Next, I'm going to write lines, replace that. You can see it's stopped, it's executed the whole queue. So I'll just go on and do circuit. So Share, Export Movie, and we want to overwrite the existing circuit, replace that, and very quickly I'm going to move on just to show you how this works. Turn off circuit, turn on lights, Export Movie, and lights. And let's just have a look at the render queue here. Well, actually, it's already rendered that's rather annoying. It's already rendered all the other elements, but we can actually render all of these in a queue. You don't have to wait for one to finish rendering before you render all the others. And that's a great time saver. It's well worth knowing if you're doing something like this. You want to export lots of different things from the same project. So we're done with our export, and we can save this project, and we can move on to the next step. So the next step is the fun part where we composite all this together. So let's just look at our project setup for this new project that I've made. It's going to be 1920 1080 this time. Again, 24 frames a second and a duration this time of 10 seconds. So we're going to come to import, and we're going to import our 4 rendered assets. And together they look like this. So I think I'm going to put the lights on top. Not that it matters hugely. And I think probably also I'm just going to set all of their blend modes to add. So I've selected all 4. I'm going to set the blend modes to add. It obviously brightens everything up, but it's just going to make the compositing a lot easier, I think. So before we go much further, I just want to come over to the library generators, and I want to grab a color solid and move it to the back of this group. Come to the inspector and make it black. First thing I want to do is to set up the loop, because we wanted to have a nice infinite loop for this. So I'm going to come to 723 on the timeline, and I'm going to come to mark and mark play range out. So now we've got a play range of 8 seconds. Then I'm going to take this group and I'm going to make a clone of it. And I'm going to step forward 1 frame to 8 seconds. And with the clone selected, I'm going to come to mark in, and then I'm going to come to the first frame on the timeline, still with that clone selected. I'm going to come to mark and move selected in point. And so then what we can do is we can fade out this clone over the duration of its life, which is 2 seconds. And let's do that with a basic motion fade in, fade out. We obviously don't want to fade in. The duration is 2 seconds, and that is 48 frames for the fade out time. So now if I play from here towards the end of the loop, you can see we smoothly transition back to the start. I mean, it's not that smooth yet, but we haven't really sort of set the whole thing up. There's no obvious hiccup. That's the point that I would make. Okay, let's think about how we're going to composite all of this. I think we should probably just do it one step at a time. Let's turn off everything apart from the lights. And I'm going to show you the basic principle of this, and we're going to apply that to pretty much everything in this compositing operation. So I'm going to duplicate the lights, and I'm just going to move them along. Probably it's kind of like 2 seconds or something. I've moved them along there. And I'm also going to come in and rotate them. So rotate them through 90 degrees. And we've got something different like that. So it's all looking pretty nice like that. I think that's all we need to do with the lights. And actually, while we're setting the whole thing up, I think we should probably make a new group at the top, object new group, drop these 2 groups into it. Let's first of all give it some color. So filters, color, and colorize. I want to make sure that this remap black is actually set to black, not that rather odd default of very, very dark red. And let's just play with this color. Let's go with, I don't know, something like, don't know, there. Okay. And then let's come to color and levels. And then we want these bright spots to be really bright. So let's just first of all crunch it down a lot like that using this white value there. And maybe crunch down the blacks a little bit as well, just so we've got a nice contrasty look. That's much better. And let's drop in filters, glow and neon. Let's reduce the mix value down to 20%. And let's increase that outer glow value to 200. This would obviously will look much nicer if you used Hawaii Super Glow, but I'm not going to insist that you do that. Okay, so what else can we do? Let's come back into our original group here. Let's think about adding in the lines. So the lines are here. It's just as well we took down their level, because obviously that's way too much. Let's go for about 10% on the lines. And I think they work pretty well, even just as faint as that. And they do really sort of help to give that sort of sense of 3D depth. And again, let's do that same thing. Let's duplicate those lines, drag them along quite a bit, like that. And of course, we want to do a rotation. So let's go for, I don't know, -90 on that. And maybe just increase their scale just a tiny bit or something, just so it's not exactly the same. So let's now look at the grid, and I'm just going to put the grid at the back, just above the color solid, turn it on. It's very, very bright as is. So again, let's reduce its level. Let's make it go for 15 maybe. I like the way this is also giving us some irregularity to the overall look. And we can do exactly the same thing, duplicate it, move it along, just find a spot where it looks good, and again, just rotate it. Say 270, doesn't really matter, it's all rather arbitrary. You choose. So I really quite like how it's looking already. I think what I'll do is just drop in a new group above this second group in here, Object New Group. Into that group, I'm going to add a circle. So Shift and Option key, draw out a circle, center it up, shape. I'm going to make this really small. I'm going to make it 5 pixels. That seems crazy, but then I'm going to expand it back out again using the feather. Maybe even make it even smaller. Let's actually go for 2. It's really quite hard to get the right level of this. And actually maybe I'll just use a blur to get it to blur out even more than the feather. So Gaussian blur, and let's just blur it like that. So we've got a fairly bright core, but a nice sort of soft edge. So sort of 360 or something for that blur. And just so it's not got that overall color, I'm going to Option drag it out into a new group at the top there. So we've got a whiter, brighter core like that. And now let's finally look at adding back in the circuit. Turn that back on again. Again, we just need to really knock it back. So let's go for, I don't know, 15 on that. But I really like the way this gives you this extra detail. Really quite subtle. Maybe even go for 10. Just keep it really faint. And again, let's duplicate it. Right click, duplicate, and rotate it 90 degrees. I'm going to have quite a lot of these. I'm going to move that along about 1.5 seconds. Duplicate it again. Have a different rotation. Let's go for 180. Move it along a bit more like that. And we're going to sort of get layers of this. And you can see now we're really kind of disguising that loop pretty well because we've added in all these offset layers. But just before we go, there is one thing I would like to point out if you have the patience to bear with me, and that is that we can do slightly better with these circuits. So I'm actually going to drop them into a new group. So Object New Group, drop those into there. And I'm going to switch their blend mode to normal. And nothing much has happened just yet. The other thing we need to do is we need to set their layer order. So the one that is starting first needs to be on top. So I'm going to drag that up there. So I'm doing this in the timeline editor, obviously, and then this one to here. So the reverse order, basically. So the top one is the one that's first, then the next one, and then the next one. Now we've actually got them in their order, and we've got them using their alpha channel rather than just adding them together. And we can maybe increase that mix value to around 20%. So that's with all 3 of them selected. And then, let me just close down the timeline editor. With the group selected, we can just add a color and levels, and then just crunch in the blacks a bit like that. And let's just push the gamma as well a bit like that. And that's made a lot of difference, as you can see. We've got a lot more of the detail of these individual layers. It's a very different sort of effect. It's much more about these circuit boards now. Just my personal preference anyway. So anyway, that's the effect. I hope you have fun playing with it. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll see you again soon.